So, a lot of people are talking about the Nintendo Switch 2's hardware. Now, of course, I can list off all of the hardware and tell you guys a bunch of numbers that you most likely won't understand. But for me, the Nintendo Switch 1 was an incredibly underpowered system, even on the first day it released. And considering the games that were on the Nintendo Switch, I was pleasantly surprised how well Nintendo optimized all of their games, and especially those impossible ports like Doom 2016, Doom Eternal, the Batman trilogy, all of the Resident Evil games. A lot of people were saying that Resident Evil 5 wouldn't work because the Tegra 1 chip was underpowered. But not only does Resident Evil 5 play incredibly well, it brought split-screen co-op back to Resident Evil 5 on the PC as well. So judging by the fact that the Nintendo Switch 2 is about 10 times more powerful than the Switch 1, I'm assuming we're going to have infinite games for it. And regardless of how many people are nostalgic towards their original Switches, Nintendo Switch 2 is going to have so many games that nobody can deny the value in the Switch 2 compared to something like the Switch 1, due to it playing way more modern titles like Doom the Dark Ages, and with all of the upcoming upgrades for Switch 1 titles, I'm sure that there's going to be plenty to play, especially since Nintendo is the master of optimization. Back then when the Nintendo 64 was very popular, there was a game called Resident Evil 2 that was going to be ported to it. A lot of people thought that was impossible because Resident Evil 2 was 1.9 gigabytes, and the cartridges for the Nintendo 64 were only 64 megabytes. So a lot of people thought that was actually impossible, but Nintendo proved everyone wrong and fit the entirety of Resident Evil 2 by cutting a few cutscenes and audio here and there into a 64 megabyte cartridge. So due to that fact, I think that Nintendo knows a thing or two about optimizing games, especially when they have a lot of limitations. Games like Batman Arkham Knight play pretty well on the Switch 1. I think it even looks good in handheld mode on the Switch Lite, of course. I'm not sure exactly how well it looks when docked. I'm pretty sure it's ugly, but everybody knows that the Switch 2 has about double the power when docked opposed to handheld. So even if there are limitations, you're most likely not going to see them when docking the Switch 2. But the fact that the system has 3 teraflops is kind of crazy. That's like infinite power when you're measuring it against a company like Nintendo. Those developers that are working in the company have gone through impossible hurdles. I mean, they made the original Resident Evil 4, and that's said to be the greatest game of all time. The remake was also the greatest remake of all time. But of course, that wasn't made by Nintendo, only the original version, which is said to be the best version, and that was for the Nintendo GameCube. Of course, it does take Nintendo a lot longer to optimize games when there are limitations, and I think that's what people are most likely worrying about when it comes to the hardware specs of Switch 2. They're thinking, okay, so even if there is limitations of some kind, especially when comparing to a PlayStation 5, because there are limitations, it's going to take longer for Nintendo to optimize these games, since it did take around 8 years for Nintendo to release Arkham Knight. So yes, that is a problem, and most likely we are going to run into a lot of delays when coming to newer games like Doom the Dark Ages. Even though we're hearing from the grapevine that Nintendo is working on Doom the Dark Ages, most likely that's not going to be announced, and it might be in a delicate state currently. So it might be too soon for Nintendo to tell anyone just yet. This is a company that doesn't like to get your hopes up. In fact, they would rather give you more bad news than good. So my expectations for modern titles are a bit low, but seeing how fast Cyberpunk 2077 was said to be ported and not playable on the Nintendo Switch 2, as well as games like Split Fiction, which just released and are going to be available on launch day, I'm sure that other modern titles will have no problem, since games like Split Fiction break the barrier of what I thought was possible in a video game. I wanted to talk about this game because I finished it with my partner, and I thought that it was one of the most impressive games, and to see that game running on the Switch 2 is going to be magnificent. But I'm sure Nintendo will have no problem managing and developing with these specs that are quote-unquote underpowered for Nintendo. I think the Nintendo Switch 2 will do just fine. But yeah, guys, what do you think about the hardware limitations of the Nintendo Switch 2? Of course, on paper, it doesn't look that impressive, but it is said to be an underpowered 2050, and I think if you give Nintendo a 2050, that's plenty of power for them. And considering what Nvidia has done in their past, I'm sure that a senior tech company can make it work with a senior video game company. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Later.